My daughter texted from her babysitting job. "Dad, Mr. Presser said his wife isn't coming home. He's asking me to help him in the bedroom." The text came through at 9:47 p.m. while I was finishing paperwork in my home office. Chloe was babysitting for the Presser family 3 blocks away, watching their 8-year-old twins while the parents supposedly went to dinner. My hands started shaking as I read the message again, hoping I'd misunderstood something. The formal way she'd written it, using Mr. Presser instead of his first name, told me she was scared and trying to be careful about what she said in case he was watching her phone. I grabbed my car keys and ran to the garage without bothering to lock the house behind me. The drive to the Presser house took less than 3 minutes, but it felt like an eternity as worst-case scenarios flashed through my mind. Chloe was only 16, a responsible kid who babysat regularly for families in our neighborhood to save money for college. She'd never sent me a text like this before, never hinted at feeling unsafe with any of her babysitting families. The urgency in her message made my chest tight with panic. The Presser house looked normal from the outside, warm light glowing from the living room windows, and Mrs. Presser's car missing from the driveway as expected. I parked on the street and walked quickly to the front door, trying to look calm while my heart hammered against my ribs. Before I could knock, I heard voices inside. A man's voice, deeper than I remembered from the few times I'd met Richard Presser, speaking in urgent tones that I couldn't quite make out through the thick wooden door. I knocked firmly, but not aggressively, not wanting to escalate whatever situation was happening inside. The voices stopped immediately, followed by footsteps moving toward the door. Richard opened it looking disheveled and slightly out of breath, his shirt wrinkled and his hair messed up in ways that suggested more than just casual evening at home. His eyes were bloodshot and he smelled strongly of alcohol, which explained the slurred quality I'd noticed in his voice moments earlier. He seemed genuinely surprised to see me standing on his doorstep, his face cycling through confusion, annoyance, and something that looked almost like fear. When he asked what I was doing there, his words came out slightly slurred and too loud for the quiet residential street. I told him Chloe had texted me about needing help with something, and I'd come to check on her. His expression shifted to what he probably thought was casual friendliness, but his eyes remained guarded and calculating. Richard stepped aside to let me in, gesturing toward the living room with exaggerated politeness that felt performed rather than genuine. The house was messier than I'd expected, with toys scattered across the floor and dishes piled in the kitchen sink visible through the open doorway. I could hear a television playing upstairs, probably keeping the twins occupied, while the adults dealt with whatever drama was unfolding downstairs. The normalcy of the domestic scene made the tension in the air feel even more disturbing. Chloe appeared at the top of the staircase, her face pale and her eyes wide with relief when she saw me. She was still wearing the same clothes she'd left home in earlier, but her sweater was pulled tight around herself, and her arms were crossed protectively over her chest. When she started down the stairs toward us, I noticed her hands were shaking slightly, though she was clearly trying to maintain composure in front of Richard and avoid making the situation worse. She explained that Mrs. Presser had called an hour ago to say she wouldn't be coming home tonight due to a family emergency, leaving Richard to handle the evening routine with the twins. Her voice was steady, but I caught the subtle emphasis she placed on certain words, the way she glanced quickly at Richard before looking back at me. She was communicating something more than the surface story, using the kind of coded language that comes from years of a father-daughter relationship built on trust and understanding. Richard jumped in to elaborate, explaining that his wife had driven to her mother's house 2 hours away after receiving news about a medical crisis. His story sounded rehearsed, with too many specific details about timing and logistics that felt designed to convince rather than inform. When he mentioned that he'd asked Chloe to help him get the twins ready for bed, something in his tone made my skin crawl. The way he looked at her while speaking suggested layers of meaning that made my protective instincts flare immediately. I suggested that since Mrs. Presser wasn't coming home, it might be better if Chloe came home with me rather than staying overnight to help with morning routines. The offer was phrased politely, but Richard's reaction was immediate and defensive. He insisted that Chloe had already agreed to stay until morning, that the twins were attached to her and would be upset if she left suddenly. His desperation to keep her there was thinly veiled behind concern for his children's emotional well-being. Chloe spoke up quickly, saying she'd actually prefer to come home tonight since she had early morning plans she'd forgotten about when she originally agreed to stay over. Her voice carried a note of finality that brooked no argument, though she maintained the polite tone appropriate for addressing an employer. Richard's face darkened at her words, and I saw his hands clench into fists at his sides before he forced them to relax. The brief glimpse of anger was enough to confirm my suspicions about what had really been happening. The twins appeared at the top of the stairs in their pajamas, rubbing sleepy eyes and asking when their mother was coming home. Richard's demeanor immediately shifted to devoted father mode, his voice becoming gentle and reassuring as he explained that Mommy had to help Grandma tonight, but would be back tomorrow. The contrast between his behavior toward his children and the predatory energy I'd sensed when he looked at Chloe was stark and deeply unsettling. I told Richard we'd gather Chloe's things and head home, keeping my voice neutral but firm. He seemed to realize that arguing further would only make his behavior look more suspicious, so he agreed with forced cheerfulness. While Chloe collected her backpack and jacket from the kitchen, I remained in the living room with Richard, maintaining casual conversation while watching his every move. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut, both of us aware of the unspoken conflict happening beneath the surface politeness. As we prepared to leave, Richard made one final attempt to convince Chloe to return the following evening, mentioning that Mrs. Presser might need to stay with her mother for several days. The offer came with a promise of extra payment and flexible hours, but his eagerness was so transparent that it felt more like begging than negotiating. Chloe politely declined, saying she had commitments with other families that would prevent her from taking on additional overnight sitting jobs. The drive home passed in loaded silence, both of us processing what had just happened without yet feeling safe enough to discuss it openly. Chloe stared out the passenger window while I focused on driving, giving her space to decompress from whatever had occurred before I arrived. Once we were safely inside our own house with the doors locked, she collapsed onto the living room couch and finally allowed herself to show the fear she'd been suppressing for the past hour. Her story came out in fragments, interrupted by tears and moments where she had to pause to collect herself. Richard had been drinking steadily since his wife left, becoming increasingly inappropriate in his comments and behavior toward Chloe throughout the evening. What started as casual compliments about her maturity and responsibility had escalated to personal questions about her dating life and physical comments that made her profoundly uncomfortable. When he'd asked her to help him in the bedroom under the pretense of changing bedsheets, she'd known the situation was dangerous. She'd managed to deflect his advances by suggesting they focus on getting the twins settled first, buying herself time to text me while he was in the bathroom. Her quick thinking and ability to maintain composure under pressure had likely prevented a much worse situation from developing. The courage it must have taken for a 16-year-old girl to navigate that scenario while protecting both herself and the children in her care filled me with both pride and heartbreak. I called the police immediately, despite Chloe's initial reluctance to involve law enforcement. She was worried about causing drama in the neighborhood and concerned that other families might not trust her with babysitting if word got out about the incident. I explained that Richard's behavior was criminal and that reporting it was the only way to protect her and potentially other young women from similar situations. The decision wasn't just about our family, it was about community safety and accountability. Officer Janet Williams arrived within 20 minutes, a veteran with the department who specialized in cases involving minors. Her calm, professional demeanor helped Chloe feel comfortable enough to provide a detailed statement about the evening's events. She explained that Richard's behavior constituted criminal solicitation of a minor and potentially attempted sexual assault, charges serious enough to warrant immediate investigation. The officer's validation that Chloe's fears were justified and that she'd done everything right helped ease some of the guilt and self-doubt my daughter was experiencing. While Officer Williams took Chloe's statement, I found myself wrestling with rage and helplessness in equal measure. Richard Presser was a respected member of our community, a successful architect who served on the school board and coached Little League. The thought that he'd been hiding predatory behavior behind his public persona made me question how well any of us really knew our neighbors. How many other young babysitters had he targeted? How many families trusted him with their children, unaware of his true nature? The investigation moved quickly once formal charges were filed. Detective Ray Murphy, who handled crimes against children, interviewed Chloe again in a more formal setting with victim advocates present. He explained that cases like this often involved patterns of behavior, and that Richard's attempt to assault Chloe likely wasn't an isolated incident. The detective's experience with similar cases helped prepare us for what lay ahead, including the possibility that other victims might come forward once news of the charges became public. Within 48 hours of filing the police report, Detective Murphy called with news that confirmed our worst fears. 2 other teenage girls had contacted the department after hearing about Richard's arrest through community gossip. Both had worked as babysitters for the Presser family within the past 18 months, and both reported similar patterns of inappropriate behavior that had escalated over time. One girl had quit abruptly after Richard made physical contact that crossed clear boundaries. The other had been too frightened to return after he'd cornered her in the kitchen late one evening. The pattern that emerged from the testimonies painted a picture of calculated predation disguised as casual family interactions. Richard had a system for identifying vulnerable targets, typically younger babysitters from single-parent homes or families with financial stress who couldn't afford to lose the income. He'd gradually push boundaries through comments and requests, testing how much inappropriate behavior each girl would tolerate before escalating to physical contact. His position of authority as an employer and respected community member had protected him from suspicion while giving him access to potential victims. Mrs. Presser's reaction to her husband's arrest shocked everyone who knew the family. Instead of expressing horror at his behavior or concern for the victims, she hired an expensive defense attorney and began a campaign to discredit the girls who'd come forward. She spread rumors through social media and neighborhood gossip networks, suggesting that the teenagers were lying for attention or money. Her aggressive defense of Richard, despite overwhelming evidence of his guilt, divided the community and made the legal process more painful for everyone involved. The preliminary hearing was held 6 weeks after Richard's arrest, with all 3 victims required to testify about their experiences. Watching Chloe walk to the witness stand in the packed courtroom took every ounce of self-control I possessed. She wore a simple blue dress and spoke clearly and calmly about what had happened that night, her voice never wavering despite the intense scrutiny from Richard's defense team. The lawyer tried to paint her as a confused teenager who'd misinterpreted innocent requests for help, but Chloe's detailed account of events left no room for alternative explanations. The other two victims, 17-year-old Maya Chen and 15-year-old Ashley Barnes, provided testimony that established a clear pattern of escalating predatory behavior. Maya described how Richard had gradually increased inappropriate physical contact during her months working for the family, culminating in an attempted assault that she'd escaped by threatening to scream and wake the children. Ashley's testimony revealed that Richard had shown her pornographic material on his phone, claiming it was part of her education about adult relationships that her parents weren't providing. Richard's defense strategy centered on attacking the credibility of teenage witnesses and suggesting that the charges were part of a conspiracy among the girls to extort money from a wealthy family. His lawyer pointed to Richard's community involvement and professional success as evidence of his good character, arguing that such a respected man couldn't possibly be guilty of the alleged crimes. The defense's attempts to victim blame and gaslight the teenagers in open court were so egregious that the judge had to issue warnings about inappropriate questions and tactics. The prosecution's case was strengthened by digital evidence recovered from Richard's devices during the investigation. Detective Murphy had obtained a search warrant for the Presser home and discovered a collection of inappropriate images and videos that Richard had secretly recorded of teenage babysitters working in his house. The footage showed him making the same inappropriate comments and requests to multiple girls over time, establishing a pattern of predation that contradicted his claims of innocence. Some of the recordings dated back over 3 years, suggesting his criminal behavior had been ongoing much longer than initially suspected. The discovery of the secret recordings sent shockwaves through our community and prompted additional victims to come forward. Parents who had employed Richard for architectural services began questioning whether their own daughters had been safe around him. The local newspaper ran a front-page story about the case that included a request for any additional victims to contact law enforcement, leading to 6 more families reporting suspicious behavior or inappropriate comments that they'd previously dismissed as harmless. During this period, Chloe struggled with anxiety and nightmares related to her experience. She'd wake up several times a week in a cold sweat, convinced she could hear Richard's voice calling her name. Simple activities like walking to school or going to the store became sources of stress as she worried about encountering community members who believed Mrs. Presser's version of events. We started therapy sessions with Dr. Lisa Chen, a specialist in trauma counseling for adolescents, who helped Chloe process the experience and develop coping strategies for the ongoing legal proceedings. The trial was scheduled for 8 months after Richard's initial arrest, giving both sides time to prepare their cases thoroughly. During the interim, Richard remained out on bail despite the prosecutor's requests for detention, living in his family home just blocks away from us. The knowledge that he was still in the neighborhood made everyone feel unsafe, particularly the teenage girls who'd testified against him. Several families, including Maya's and Ashley's parents, installed security systems and changed their daily routines to avoid potential encounters with Richard or his supporters. As the trial date approached, Richard's defense team attempted several legal maneuvers to get the charges dismissed or reduced. They filed motions claiming that the search warrant for the digital evidence had been improperly obtained, arguing that the recordings should be excluded from the trial. They also requested that the 3 cases be tried separately rather than together, hoping to prevent the jury from seeing the full pattern of Richard's predatory behavior. The judge denied both motions, ruling that the evidence was properly obtained and that the similar nature of the crimes justified a joint trial. The media attention surrounding the case intensified as the trial began, with local news stations covering the proceedings daily. Richard's status as a school board member and community leader made the story particularly newsworthy, raising questions about how predators hide in plain sight within trusted institutions. The coverage brought unwanted attention to our family, with reporters occasionally showing up at our house seeking interviews or comments about the case. We declined all media requests, focusing instead on supporting Chloe through the difficult process of testifying in a high-profile criminal trial. The prosecution's opening statement laid out a compelling case against Richard, describing him as a calculating predator who had used his position of trust and authority to target vulnerable teenage victims. The prosecutor walked the jury through the timeline of events, showing how Richard's behavior had escalated from inappropriate comments to physical assault attempts across multiple victims. The defense countered with claims that the charges were based on misunderstandings and teenage fantasy, painting Richard as a devoted father who'd been wrongly accused by attention-seeking adolescents. Chloe's testimony during the trial was even more powerful than her preliminary hearing appearance. She'd grown more confident and articulate during the months of preparation, and her account of that night at the Presser house was detailed and devastating. The defense attorney's cross-examination was aggressive and lengthy, but Chloe never wavered in her responses or allowed herself to be confused by misleading questions. When the lawyer suggested she'd invented the story for attention, Chloe looked directly at the jury and asked why any teenager would choose to endure months of public scrutiny and victim blaming for something that never happened. Maya and Ashley's testimonies provided crucial corroborating evidence that established Richard's pattern of behavior beyond any reasonable doubt. Maya broke down in tears while describing how Richard had cornered her in the laundry room and attempted to remove her clothing, only stopping when she threatened to scream. Ashley's voice shook as she testified about the pornographic materials Richard had shown her, explaining how confused and frightened she'd been by his claims that such exposure was normal and educational. The impact of their testimonies on the jury was visible, with several members appearing visibly disturbed by the details. The digital evidence proved to be the most damning aspect of the prosecution's case. Detective Murphy presented dozens of recordings that showed Richard making inappropriate comments and requests to teenage babysitters over several years. The footage captured him telling one girl that she was more mature than other teenagers, asking another about her boyfriend's sexual experience, and offering a third girl alcohol while his wife was away. The recordings made it impossible for the defense to claim that Richard's behavior had been misunderstood or taken out of context. Expert testimony from Dr. Maria Santos, a forensic psychologist specializing in predatory behavior, helped the jury understand the psychological tactics Richard had employed to manipulate his victims. She explained how predators like Richard use gradual boundary violations to test potential victims, escalating their behavior based on how much inappropriate conduct each target will tolerate. Her analysis of the recorded interactions showed classic grooming patterns, including isolation, normalization of inappropriate behavior, and threats designed to maintain secrecy and compliance. Richard took the stand in his own defense, a risky strategy that his attorneys had apparently decided was necessary to counter the overwhelming evidence against him. His testimony was carefully coached and rehearsed, presenting him as a misunderstood family man whose kindness toward teenage employees had been twisted into something sinister. He claimed that all of his interactions with the babysitters had been innocent and appropriate, suggesting that the girls had conspired together to create false accusations that would destroy his reputation and career. The prosecution's cross-examination of Richard was methodical and devastating, walking him through each piece of digital evidence and forcing him to explain his recorded statements and behavior. When confronted with footage of himself telling a 16-year-old babysitter that she had a beautiful body, Richard claimed he'd been complimenting her fitness level as encouragement for healthy living. His explanations became increasingly absurd and desperate as the prosecutor systematically dismantled each alibi and justification he attempted to offer. Closing arguments took place on a Friday afternoon, with the prosecution delivering a passionate plea for justice that emphasized the courage of the 3 teenage victims who had risked public scrutiny to hold Richard accountable. The prosecutor reminded the jury that predators like Richard rely on community disbelief and victim blaming to escape consequences, making it crucial that the justice system protect vulnerable young people from exploitation by trusted authority figures. The defense's closing argument repeated familiar themes about teenage fantasy and conspiracy, but the lawyer's words rang hollow after days of damning evidence and testimony. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges against Richard. The speed of their decision suggested that the evidence had been overwhelming and that the jurors had found Richard's denials completely unconvincing. When the foreman read the verdicts aloud, Richard's face went white, and he gripped the defense table so hard his knuckles turned white. Mrs. Presser let out a wail from the gallery before being escorted from the courtroom by bailiffs, still protesting her husband's innocence despite the unanimous verdict. Sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks after the trial concluded, giving the probation department time to prepare a comprehensive report on Richard's background and the impact of his crimes on the victims. During this period, additional victims continued to come forward, including several who were now adults, but had been targeted by Richard years earlier when they were teenagers. The pattern of behavior extended back nearly a decade, suggesting that dozens of young women had potentially been victimized by his predatory conduct over the years. Chloe participated in the victim impact portion of the sentencing hearing, reading a statement she'd written about how Richard's actions had affected her life and her trust in adults who held positions of authority. She described the nightmares, anxiety, and loss of innocence that resulted from his attempted assault, explaining how the experience had changed her relationship with the world around her. Her statement was powerful and articulate, demonstrating both her resilience and the lasting harm that Richard's crimes had caused. The judge sentenced Richard to 12 years in prison on the multiple charges, with no possibility of parole for the first 8 years. The sentence reflected both the serious nature of his crimes and the pattern of predatory behavior that had victimized numerous teenagers over many years. Richard was also required to register as a sex offender and was permanently banned from any employment or volunteer work that would give him access to minors. The judge's comments during sentencing were particularly harsh, describing Richard as a calculating predator who had betrayed the trust of families throughout the community. Mrs. Presser filed for divorce within days of Richard's sentencing, apparently having finally accepted the overwhelming evidence of her husband's guilt. She sold the family home and moved out of state with the twins, seeking to escape the notoriety and judgment that had followed the trial. Several other families who had employed Richard for architectural services also faced scrutiny and questions about whether they had witnessed inappropriate behavior that they'd failed to report to authorities. The community response to Richard's conviction was mixed, with some residents expressing relief that a predator had been removed from their neighborhood, while others continued to question the validity of the charges despite the guilty verdict. Several school board meetings were dominated by discussions about background checks and oversight procedures for board members, leading to policy changes designed to prevent similar situations in the future. The case sparked broader conversations about how communities can better protect children from predators who hide behind respectable facades. Maya, Ashley, and the other victims who had come forward during the trial were praised by victim advocacy groups for their courage in speaking out against Richard, despite intense pressure and victim blaming from his supporters. Their willingness to testify had not only secured Richard's conviction, but had also encouraged other victims to seek help and report similar crimes. The ripple effects of their bravery extended far beyond our community, inspiring legislative discussions about stronger protections for teenage workers and clearer guidelines for reporting suspicious behavior. Chloe continued therapy for several months after the trial concluded, working through the trauma and rebuilding her confidence in her ability to recognize and respond to dangerous situations. She eventually returned to babysitting, but with stricter safety protocols including regular check-ins and clear guidelines about appropriate employer behavior. Her experience had taught her valuable lessons about trusting her instincts and speaking up when adults crossed boundaries, skills that would serve her well throughout her life. The Presser house remained empty for months after Mrs. Presser moved away, eventually selling to a young couple who were unaware of its history. The new owners were shocked to learn about Richard's crimes and the events that had taken place in their home, but decided to stay and work on creating new, positive memories in the space. Some neighbors welcomed them warmly, while others remained distant, still processing the revelation that a trusted community member had been hiding such dark secrets. 2 years after Richard's conviction, I received a call from Detective Murphy informing me that additional charges were being filed against Richard based on evidence discovered in a cold case review. DNA evidence had linked him to a sexual assault that had occurred 15 years earlier before he'd married and moved to our neighborhood. The victim in that case had been a college student who was assaulted after accepting a ride home from a bar, and Richard's conviction in our case had prompted investigators to re-examine unsolved crimes with similar characteristics. The revelation that Richard's criminal behavior extended back decades and included even more serious offenses reinforced the importance of Chloe's decision to speak out about her experience. Without her courage in reporting the attempted assault, Richard would have continued victimizing young women while hiding behind his respectable community facade. The additional charges ensured that Richard would spend significantly more time in prison, likely the rest of his life, protecting countless potential future victims from his predatory behavior. Chloe graduated from high school with honors and received several scholarships for college, including one from a victim advocacy organization that recognized her courage in speaking out against Richard despite intense community pressure. She chose to study social work with a focus on child protection, inspired by her experience to help other young people navigate dangerous situations and advocate for stronger protections for vulnerable populations. Her resilience and determination to create positive change from her traumatic experience filled me with immense pride and hope for the future. 5 years later, Richard died in prison after suffering a heart attack during a confrontation with other inmates who had learned about his crimes against children. The news brought a sense of closure to our family and the other victims, knowing that he would never again have the opportunity to harm vulnerable young people. While his death didn't erase the trauma he had caused, it provided a final measure of justice and peace of mind for those whose lives he had forever altered through his predatory actions.